A single equation on a blackboard was about to shatter everything a prestigious professor believed about genius. And the quiet student he tried to humiliate would prove that brilliance has no zip code. When Professor Edmund Sterling deliberately wrote a flawed differential equation to expose what he assumed was an unqualified scholarship student, he had no idea that 12-year-old Ethan Williams was about to change his life forever. This is the story of how one moment in a classroom revealed the dangerous assumptions we make about talent, and how a boy from the forgotten side of town became a mathematical legend. The September morning felt heavy with possibility as Ethan stood before the towering gates of Thornfield Academy. His second-hand uniform carefully pressed by his mother at 5 in the morning before her hospital shift, unable to hide its worn edges. But Ethan didn't notice because his mind was already calculating architectural angles of the Victorian buildings and finding Fibonacci sequences in the ivy patterns crawling up the walls. His mother had whispered that morning while pressing a wrapped sandwich into his backpack that he belonged there and shouldn't let anyone tell him different. And Ethan clutched his scholarship letter like a lifeline, a full academic scholarship to the most prestigious prep school in the state. A dream that seemed impossible just months ago when he'd been solving differential equations on the back of grocery receipts while his mother counted pennies for rent. Other students flowed past him like expensive cologne and privilege, their voices carrying words he'd only heard on television, discussing their father's new yacht and which tutor prepared them for entrance exams, while Ethan had prepared himself with library books and free online courses. Solving problems by candlelight when the electricity got cut off, finding beauty in numbers when the world outside seemed chaotic. A blond boy bumped into him, looked him up and down, and asked if he was lost because the public school was 3 blocks down, and when Ethan showed his student ID and explained he was enrolled here. The boy smirked and said he was one of those diversity students. But Ethan had heard worse in his 12 years, and had learned that numbers didn't care about skin color or bank accounts, because in mathematics, logic reigned supreme, and 2 plus 2 equaled 4 whether you calculated it in a mansion or a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint. He found his locker, number 1847, a prime number which felt like a good omen, and as he organized his dollar store supplies, he overheard whispers about the scholarship kid and how they'd lowered standards this year, how it was all political correctness. But Ethan let the words wash over him like white noise, because he'd learned to filter out distractions when solving complex problems and people's prejudices were just another form of interference. His schedule showed advanced mathematics first period in room 314, and the number made him smile, because pi rounded to 2 decimal places was another good sign. And Ethan had been doing calculus since age 9, when he discovered his mother's old community college textbook and realized that curves and symbols told stories more beautiful than any fairy tale. The hallways were adorned with portraits of distinguished alumni, judges and senators and CEOs, all white faces staring down at him with oil-painted eyes. And Ethan wondered if his portrait would ever hang here, or if some dreams were reserved for certain postal codes. He paused outside room 314 and peered through the small window where students were already seated, chatting animatedly about summer math camps and private tutors. One boy casually mentioning how his father, a Princeton professor, had been drilling him on differential equations since middle school. And Ethan almost smiled because he'd learned differential equations from a YouTube channel on a cracked phone screen, rewinding when the connection glitched. Working problems on napkins during his mother's breaks at the diner where she used to work. The door felt heavier than it should as he pushed it open, and 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him, conversation stopping mid-sentence, and he was the only black face in a sea of privilege. As conspicuous as an error in an otherwise perfect equation, and someone muttered for him to take a seat, not unkindly but not warmly either, so Ethan chose a desk in the middle. Not too far back to seem disengaged, and not too far front to seem eager. He pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd used all last year with pages crinkled, but full of careful calculations and theoretical proofs he worked on for fun. And the classroom smelled of chalk dust and the kind of certainty that came from never having to question whether you belonged, and Ethan breathed it in. letting it fill his lungs because he belonged here not because of charity or quotas, but because numbers sang in his head like others heard music. As students continued to file in, Ethan opened his notebook to a fresh page and began sketching a proof he'd been working on. A new approach to the Collat's conjecture that had been dancing in his mind during the bus ride, his pencil moving with practiced precision in a mathematical symphony only he could hear. And he didn't notice the door open one final time, or see the tall figure with silver hair and piercing blue eyes survey the room with the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. Professor Edmund Sterling adjusted his Harvard tie in the faculty bathroom mirror, the same routine he'd followed for 37 years of teaching. The burgundy silk a gift from the dean after his third published paper on advanced number theory, and he wore it on first days as a reminder that excellence was not negotiable. At 61, Sterling had built a reputation as the gatekeeper of mathematical rigor at Thornfield Academy, and his students went on to MIT and Princeton and Caltech. But only the ones who deserved it, and that morning's faculty meeting had soured his mood when Principal Morrison announced the new scholarship program with such enthusiasm it made his teeth ache, saying they needed to open their doors wider because brilliance existed everywhere, not just in traditional places. Sterling had bitten his tongue, remembering his own journey from a middle-class background to mathematical prominence through sheer merit and proper preparation, no shortcuts and no lowered bars. And his Italian leather shoes clicked against marble floors as he made his way to room 314, where he'd taught for 30 years, and produced 27 mathematics Olympiad champions and 4 fields. Medal recipients. He paused at the doorway, surveying his advanced mathematics class where the usual suspects sat. Cameron Sterling III, his grandson looking confident in the front row. The Peterson twins with their matching calculators worth more than some people's cars, and Rebecca Park, whose parents had hired a Cambridge professor for summer tutoring, and then he saw him. The only black face in the room, seated in the middle like a statistical outlier, in an otherwise normal distribution. The boy was hunched over a notebook, pencil moving rapidly, completely absorbed, and Sterling's jaw tightened because this was one of the diversity admits Morrison had been so proud of. And he'd seen it before in his decades of teaching, well-meaning administrators pushing unprepared students into advanced classes and setting them up for failure in the name of inclusion. And the kindest thing really was to identify the problem early and redirect the student to an appropriate level to preserve the integrity of the advanced program. He announced good morning in his authoritative voice, and 21 heads snapped to attention except one, the Williams boy as the roster identified him, who continued writing for a full 3 seconds before looking up as if emerging from a trance, a rude lack of immediate response that was the first mark against him. Sterling introduced himself and made it clear that this was advanced mathematics, not arithmetic appreciation. And if students couldn't differentiate between integration by parts and integration by substitution, they were in the wrong room. And a few nervous chuckles followed, while the Williams boy merely tilted his head slightly, as if processing the distinction was beneath consideration, which made Sterling's irritation spike. He explained they'd be covering topics typically reserved for college freshmen, and some of them, with his gaze lingering pointedly on Ethan, may find the pace challenging. And there was no shame in recognizing one's limitations early, then turned to the board to write out the course outline while behind him he could feel the room's energy. Anticipation from his usual stars and anxiety from the marginal admits, and from the Williams boy, nothing unusual. When Cameron raised his hand to ask about preparing for the Olympiad again, Sterling said naturally, though selection would be even more rigorous, because only the truly exceptional need apply. And again his eyes found Ethan because Thornfield's reputation depended on sending their absolute best. As he distributed the syllabus, Sterling's mind categorized students automatically. The Petersons would excel at computational problems but struggle with proofs. Rebecca would master theory but needed pushing on applications. And Cameron, well, nepotism aside, the boy had genuine talent groomed from birth for mathematical greatness. Sterling paused at Ethan's desk, noting the worn edges of his notebook, the dollar store calculator, the careful preservation of every inch of paper, and the boy met his gaze directly. Not defiantly, but with a quiet steadiness that was somehow more unsettling. So Sterling asked about his mathematical background and which prep courses he'd completed. Ethan replied that he'd been self-studying using library books and online resources mainly, and several students exchanged glances while the Petersons actually smirked. And Sterling felt his suspicions confirmed because self-study was code for unprepared. So he asked about the previous school, and when Ethan said Martin Luther King Elementary, a public school, the smirks grew wider. Sterling nodded slowly, filing this information away, thinking Morrison had truly outdone herself throwing a public school student into advanced mathematics at Thornfield. And he told Ethan he hoped his self-study had prepared him adequately because mathematics at this level required more than enthusiasm. Moving on before the boy could respond, though something nagged at him, because the notebook he'd glimpsed had writing that looked almost like advanced work. But public school students didn't independently work on Collat's conjecture variations, so the boy was probably just doodling to look impressive. As Sterling began his opening lecture on the beauty and rigor of pure mathematics, his mind was already formulating a plan, a test early and decisive to demonstrate the folly of lowering standards. Something that would reveal true mathematical understanding versus superficial preparation. And he thought of his own mentor, Professor Hartwell, who'd once told him that mathematics was the ultimate meritocracy where numbers don't lie and don't care about good intentions. By the end of class, he designed the perfect assessment, something that would separate the wheat from the chaff, the prepared from the pretenders. And when young Williams inevitably struggled, it would be a teachable moment for everyone, including Principal Morrison, because the boy needed to learn that Thornfield Academy wasn't a charity and mathematics wasn't a democracy, and some people simply weren't meant for the rarefied air of advanced mathematics, so the kindest thing was to help them realize it early. Sterling smiled to himself as he wrote the first equation on the board, confident that by week's end, the Williams situation would resolve itself, and his advanced class would return to its proper composition of students who belonged there by merit. Not misguided social engineering, and he had no idea how wrong he was about to be proven. Wednesday morning arrived with crisp autumn air that made Thornfield Academy's Gothic towers look particularly imposing. And Professor Sterling stood at his classroom board, crafting his trap with the precision of a mathematician and the cunning of a chess master, the equation flowing from his fingers onto the board. A differential equation complex enough to challenge college students with one subtle, deliberate error, embedded in the third line where he changed a positive to a negative sign. A modification that would cascade through the solution, making it impossible to solve correctly without first identifying the mistake. It was perfect because any student who'd been properly prepared through legitimate tutoring and systematic study would recognize the standard form and spot the anomaly. But someone who'd merely memorized procedures or relied on self-study would blindly follow the incorrect path, and his pencil flew across the paper, building an architecture of logic. Students filed in with Cameron greeting him with confident familiarity, the Peterson twins comparing notes from their private tutor, Rebecca already reviewing yesterday's problems. And then Ethan Williams walking with that same quiet determination and taking his middle seat without fanfare. His notebook already open and covered in neat rows of calculations that from Sterling's vantage point looked like a novel approach to Riemann sums. Though he shook his head, thinking the boy was probably just copying problems from some website. Sterling began the class by saying they'd review material students should all be familiar with from their preparatory work, gesturing to the equation on the board and calling it a standard second-order linear differential equation with variable coefficients, asking who could walk them through the solution while Cameron's hand shot up eager as always, and the Petersons looked confident, and Rebecca was already working through it in her notebook. But Sterling's attention was fixed on Ethan, who stared at the board with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the chalk itself, the boy's eyes moving through the equation line by line. And then there it was, the slightest furrowing of brow at the third line, a pause in the rhythmic tracking of his pupils because he'd noticed something. Sterling prompted the class, saying surely this was elementary for students of their caliber, and when Bradley Peterson offered to solve it. Sterling ignored him and said he was curious about their newer students' preparation, his gaze fixing on Ethan with laser precision, as he said surely Ethan could solve this since his self-study must have covered differential equations. The room grew silent as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward Ethan, some sympathetic and most anticipating entertainment, because the scholarship kid being put on the spot was better than morning coffee for the Thornfield elite, and Ethan remained seated for a moment, his fingers absently tapping against his notebook, not nervously, but as if working through calculations in the air, before saying there was an issue with the equation as written. Cameron actually laughed, and someone muttered that he couldn't even read it properly. And Sterling felt a surge of satisfaction, thinking the boy was trying to deflect to avoid admitting he couldn't solve it. So when Ethan said there was an issue, Sterling replied that this was a textbook example, and perhaps his online resources weren't as comprehensive as he believed. Ethan stood slowly, his second-hand uniform hanging a bit loose on his slim frame, and asked if he could approach the board, and Sterling stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, saying by all means, "Please enlighten us about this issue." And as Ethan walked to the front, Jason Miller stage whispered that this should be good because the kid probably thinks differential means subtraction. But something in Ethan's bearing made Sterling's confidence waver slightly because the boy moved with purpose, not the shuffling reluctance of someone about to be exposed. And he picked up the chalk with familiar ease, as if he'd held 1,000 pieces before. Then said the equation as written had a sign error in the third line, because Sterling had written negative xy when the standard form required positive xy for this type of equation. The room fell absolutely silent, and Sterling felt his face begin to warm as the boy had not only spotted the error but identified it precisely. And furthermore, Ethan continued, while turning to face the class with quiet confidence. If they were to proceed with the equation, as written they'd get a divergent series, in the solution that would violate the boundary conditions implied by the coefficient structure. Cameron's hand slowly lowered, and students exchanged uncertain glances, while Rebecca was rapidly checking her work, her face showing growing amazement. And Sterling thought this was impossible because no public school student, no matter how talented, should be able to spot that error so quickly, much less understand the mathematical implications. Sterling said Ethan was suggesting he made an error, and Ethan replied with respect, "Sir." "Yes," then asked if Sterling would like him to show the correct solution. And the challenge in the question made Sterling feel the eyes of his students upon him, feel his carefully constructed test crumbling, and he had two choices: admit the error and reveal his deliberate trap, or double down and risk his credibility. Sterling heard himself say that Ethan was mistaken, and this was precisely the form used in advanced applications. Perhaps his self-study hadn't exposed him to variations beyond basic textbook forms. And a few students nodded uncertainly, trusting their professor's authority over the scholarship kid's claim. But Ethan didn't back down, and instead did something that would haunt Sterling for weeks to come. He smiled, not smugly or disrespectfully, but with the pure joy of someone who lived for mathematical truth, and said then, "Perhaps, Professor, he could demonstrate why the negative sign creates an inconsistency, because it might be instructive for the class." And Sterling felt trapped by his own device, because to refuse would seem petty and defensive, while to accept would mean watching this public school student dismantle his carefully crafted deception. Sterling said very well with a tight voice, "Show us your interpretation," and Ethan began to write with confident, precise chalk strokes. But instead of diving into calculations, he first transformed the notation, revealing the problem's underlying structure like watching someone translate hieroglyphics in real time. Explaining that if they accepted the negative sign, then, when they applied the Frobenius method, the mathematics flowed from his fingers like music, with each step building logically on the last. Sterling watched in growing disbelief as Ethan not only proved the error, but began exploring the equation from angles that showed deep intuitive understanding. And this wasn't rote learning or memorized procedures, but real mathematical thinking at a level that should have taken years of proper instruction to achieve. And when Ethan concluded by showing that the negative sign forced a contradiction in the seventh term of the series expansion, and that the equation as Professor Sterling originally intended with a positive sign yielded an elegant solution, he quickly sketched the correct solution and threw in an alternative method, using Laplace transforms almost as an afterthought. The board filled with mathematics that some college students would struggle to follow yet flowed from this 12-year-old's mind like water from a spring. And the classroom was tomb silent as Cameron stared at the board with his mouth slightly open. The Peterson twins looked lost. And Rebecca was frantically copying everything down, with her face alight with intellectual excitement. Professor Sterling stood frozen as his worldview tilted on its axis, and everything he'd assumed, every prejudice he'd harbored, every justification for his little test. All of it crumbled before the undeniable evidence on his blackboard because Ethan Williams wasn't just competent and wasn't just prepared. He was extraordinary. The silence in room 314 was so complete that the distant sound of a lawnmower outside seemed deafening. And Sterling heard himself say that Ethan was mistaken with his voice, carrying 37 years of unquestioned authority. Claiming this formulation was used in advanced applications beyond the scope of elementary textbooks. Ethan stood at the board with chalk still in hand, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, not doubt but disappointment. As if he'd expected better from a mathematician of Sterling's reputation. And he said carefully that he understood there were various formulations, but this specific error made the equation mathematically inconsistent, and if Sterling would like, he could show more. What Sterling would like, he interrupted with his face flushing deeper, was for students to trust that their instructor knew considerably more than they did about advanced mathematics. And Cameron, ever eager to support his grandfather, chimed in that maybe Ethan should sit down, because Professor Sterling literally wrote the textbook on differential equations. Ethan said quietly that it was the third edition of Advanced Differential Equations in Applied Mathematics, and he'd read it, and it was excellent. Which was why he was confused about this error, since on page 247 of that very textbook Professor Sterling explicitly stated that sign consistency in the coefficient matrix was crucial for convergence. And the room seemed to tilt. Rebecca quickly pulled out her laptop with fingers flying across the keyboard, while the Peterson twins exchanged glances that said they were completely lost, but didn't want to admit it. And Sterling's mind raced, because the boy had not only read his textbook, but could quote specific pages from memory. And his carefully constructed narrative about unprepared diversity admits was crumbling like chalk dust. Since Ethan seemed so certain, Sterling said in a dangerously quiet tone, "By all means come to the board and prove your assertion and show the class exactly where you think the error lies." A power play forcing the student to the front like a performer, because most 12-year-olds would crumble under the pressure. But Ethan simply nodded and asked politely if he could erase a section of the board. Sterling said with barely concealed sarcasm to use the entire board if needed because everyone was eager to learn from his extensive self-study, and Ethan began writing. And within seconds it became clear this was no ordinary student reciting memorized formulas because his approach was elegant, almost artistic. Starting with fundamental theory and building up the equation from first principles. Ethan explained that if they began with the assumption that their solution must satisfy certain boundary conditions, then the coefficient structure must maintain certain properties. And the mathematics flowed across the board in neat rows with each step following logically from the last. But it wasn't just the accuracy that stunned the watching students. It was the creativity because Ethan introduced a substitution that Sterling had never seen before, a clever manipulation that simplified the entire problem. Rebecca burst out, unable to contain herself, asking where he learned that substitution because it was brilliant. And Ethan paused with chalk in midair and said he developed it himself while working on a similar problem last month after noticing a pattern. And when Bradley Peterson scoffed, saying he probably just copied it from some MIT course online. Rebecca said she was searching academic databases right now, and that substitution didn't appear anywhere in the literature. It was new. The room fell silent again, and Sterling felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, because not only had the boy spotted his deliberate error, He was introducing novel mathematical techniques at 12 years old, and Ethan said softly that he would continue. Returning to the board and working through the solution with mechanical precision, though there was beauty in it too, like watching a concert pianist play scales. When he reached the point where the sign error would cause problems, he carefully demonstrated the contradiction by circling a term in red chalk and explaining that this was where the negative sign created an impossibility because the series diverged, violating the initial conditions. But with the positive sign, he quickly reworked that section, and the solution fell into place like tumblers in a lock. And furthermore, Ethan added almost as an afterthought, if they applied the Laplace transform method instead, he moved to a clean section of board and solved the entire problem again using a completely different approach and arriving at the same answer. Cameron Sterling III sat frozen in his front row seat with his usual confidence evaporated, because he'd been groomed since birth for mathematical excellence and had every advantage money could. But yet he could barely follow what Ethan was doing. And someone whispered that this was graduate-level work. Professor Sterling stood rigidly by his desk, watching his assumptions shatter with each chalk stroke, because the boy wasn't just right about the error. He was demonstrating a level of mathematical sophistication that most PhD candidates would envy. And Sterling asked in a strained voice where exactly Ethan had studied mathematics. Ethan set down the chalk, turned to face him, and said, "The public library, sir. They had Wi-Fi until 9 p.m. and the librarian misses. Rodriguez would let him stay late if he was quiet, and MIT posted their courses online for free, as did Stanford and Princeton. YouTube had excellent channels for advanced topics. And he'd learned that mathematics didn't care where you studied it, only that you understood it." The simplicity of the statement cut through Sterling's defenses like a blade, because here was a child who'd learned graduate mathematics in a public library, while Sterling's own grandson, with every privilege and advantage, struggled with basic proofs. And Ethan continued quietly asking if Sterling had written the equation incorrectly on purpose. Sterling felt the eyes of every student upon him, and he had a choice: maintain the lie and lose all credibility, or admit to his shameful test. So he said stiffly that he may have transcribed it incorrectly. And Ethan nodded slowly, but his eyes said he knew better, and everyone in the room knew better, because the scholarship kid hadn't just solved the problem. He'd exposed the professor's prejudice with mathematical precision. Ethan asked if he should return to his seat now, and Sterling managed to say yes, that would be appropriate. And as Ethan walked back to his desk, Rebecca started clapping. Just her at first, alone in the silence, but then another student joined, and then another. Not everyone, because Cameron sat rigid with embarrassment, and the Peterson twins looked confused. But enough to make their point, because they were applauding Ethan, while Sterling felt the weight of their judgment on him, since he'd tried to humiliate a brilliant student based on nothing more than prejudice and assumptions, and in doing so he'd humiliated himself. The bell rang, saving him from further embarrassment, as students gathered their things, buzzing with excitement about what they'd witnessed. And as they filed out, Sterling heard fragments of conversation about how Ethan solved it, and how that substitution was incredible, and how they couldn't believe Sterling tried to say he was wrong. Ethan was among the last to leave, carefully packing his worn notebook. And as he passed Sterling's desk, he paused and said quietly that Sterling's textbook really was excellent, especially Chapter 12 on Bessel functions. And he'd found 3 typos in the 4th edition, if Sterling was interested for the next printing. Then he was gone, leaving Sterling alone with his shame and the undeniable proof that covered his blackboard. Proof that brilliance could come from anywhere, even a public library on Martin Luther King Boulevard. The professor sank into his chair, staring at the elegant mathematics that a 12-year-old scholarship student had written. And for the first time in 37 years, Edmund Sterling wondered if he was the one who had the most to learn. Because Ethan's chalk had moved across the board with the fluid grace of a conductor's baton, revealing another layer of mathematical beauty. And the advanced substitution technique he developed transformed the complex differential equation into something almost musical in its elegance. When Rebecca interrupted, asking if he'd published this anywhere, because it could be a legitimate contribution to the field, Ethan turned from the board with chalk dust on his second-hand uniform and said published. He just kept notebooks, who would publish something from a kid. And Rebecca insisted that academic journals didn't care about age if the mathematics was sound. Then looked at Professor Sterling and asked if that wasn't right since he edited for the Journal of Applied Mathematics. Sterling heard himself say yes, the word scraping past his throat like sandpaper. The irony not lost on him that he who had judged this boy unworthy based on appearance alone was now being asked to validate his brilliance. And Ethan continued his demonstration unaware of the paradigm shift occurring in the room, showing 3 different solution methods, each more elegant than the last. And when he reached the final approach, using Laplace transforms, even the struggling students could follow the logic. Ethan set down the chalk and said the beauty of mathematics was that truth didn't depend on who discovered it, because Euler was the son of a pastor and Ramanujan was a clerk. And mathematical reality existed independent of social reality. And the philosophical depth of the statement from a 12-year-old made several students exchange glances, while Cameron slumped in his seat with his usual confidence shattered because he'd been preparing for this class since age 5 with private tutors and summer programs. Yet this public school kid understood mathematics at a level Cameron couldn't even aspire to. Professor Sterling finally found his voice and said that Ethan's solution was correct. All 3 methods were correct, and the substitution technique was, he paused, forcing out the words, innovative and possibly groundbreaking. And a murmur ran through the class because Professor Sterling never gave praise, and his approval was rarer than perfect scores on his notoriously difficult exams. However, Sterling continued grasping for some semblance of authority. Raw talent without proper guidance could lead to bad habits, and mathematics at the highest level required more than clever tricks. But Ethan interrupted, gently saying, with respect, Professor, he wouldn't call Ramanujan's work clever tricks, yet he was largely self-taught. And sometimes unconventional paths led to unexpected discoveries. The reference to Ramanujan, the legendary Indian mathematician who'd revolutionized number theory despite lacking formal training, wasn't lost on anyone because the parallel was obvious. Another outsider challenging the establishment with pure genius. And Bradley Peterson, desperate to restore some social order, spoke up saying, yeah, but Ramanujan had Hardy at Cambridge to guide him, and you can't just learn this stuff from YouTube. Ethan turned to address Bradley directly and said actually Professor Terence Tao posted regular problem sets online. Professor Strang from MIT had his entire linear algebra course available for free. The International Mathematical Olympiad published all past problems with solutions, and the only barrier to learning was curiosity and dedication. Then he walked back to his seat, with quiet dignity, leaving the board, covered with mathematics that looked more like art than arithmetic. And as he passed Rebecca's desk, she whispered that it was amazing. Sterling stared at the board with his mind reeling, because the cascade method alone was worthy of publication, and the elegant proof structure showed deep mathematical maturity. And the boy had done it all while being tested under pressure in front of a hostile audience. So Sterling said slowly that the class should work through Ethan's solution step by step, and everyone should copy this down, including the cascade substitution, because they were witnessing something unusual. For the remaining 20 minutes, Sterling found himself in the surreal position of teaching his class using a 12-year-old's method. And with each step, his respect grew alongside his shame, because the boy hadn't just solved the problem. He'd improved upon centuries of mathematical tradition. And when the bell rang, students gathered their materials with unusual quiet, because the social dynamics of the class had shifted fundamentally. Ethan Williams was no longer the charity case, the diversity admit, the kid who didn't belong. He was undeniably the best mathematician in the room, possibly including the professor. And Sterling called out for Ethan to remain after class while the other students filed out, many glancing back curiously. And Cameron paused at the door, looking between his grandfather and Ethan with confusion and something like fear, because his position as the star student groomed for greatness had evaporated in 40 minutes. When they were alone, Sterling walked slowly to the board studying Ethan's work and said the cascade method. How long did it take you to develop it? And Ethan replied, about 3 weeks, sir. He was trying to solve a problem from the 1998 Putnam competition, and noticed a pattern, and one thing led to another. Sterling said the Putnam competition was for university students, and Ethan agreed, yes, sir, but mathematics didn't check ID. And despite himself, Sterling almost smiled because the boy had a point. Then asked about Ethan's other notebooks and what else he'd been working on. Ethan hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out 3 composition notebooks with covers held together with tape, saying various things, number theory mostly, some topology. And he'd been trying to understand the Riemann hypothesis, but that was really hard. And Sterling accepted the notebooks with hands that trembled slightly, because the Riemann hypothesis was one of the great unsolved problems in mathematics with a $1 million prize for its solution. And this 12-year-old was attempting it for fun. Sterling opened the first notebook randomly and found pages of dense mathematical exploration, original proofs, novel approaches to classic problems. Questions that showed profound mathematical thinking, the kind of work he'd expect from his best graduate students. And he said that Ethan's name was Ethan, and he owed him an apology because he'd made assumptions based on factors that had nothing to do with mathematics, and that was wrong of him. Ethan looked up with those steady, intelligent eyes and asked if Sterling had written the equation wrong on purpose to test him. And Sterling's instinct was to deny it, but something in the boy's gaze demanded honesty, so he admitted yes. He'd wanted to prove that Ethan didn't belong there, but instead Ethan had proven that Sterling was the one who needed to re-examine where he belonged. Ethan said simply that Sterling belonged there because his textbook taught Ethan integration, and his papers on Bessel functions opened up entire worlds for him, and good teachers made mistakes too. The important thing was learning from them right, and the grace of the response from someone so young, someone Sterling had tried to humiliate, was devastating because here was a child who'd faced prejudice with dignity, who'd met hostility with excellence, who now offered forgiveness without being asked. Sterling said suddenly that the National Mathematics Olympiad was something Thornfield always sent a representative to, and he traditionally selected from his advanced class. Asking if Ethan would be interested, and Ethan's eyes widened with the first genuine childlike response Sterling had seen from him as he asked, really, but he'd only been there a week. Sterling said that mathematics didn't check enrollment duration either, echoing the boy's earlier words, and based on what he'd seen today, Ethan wasn't just qualified. He might be the strongest candidate Thornfield had ever had, and Ethan thanked him while Sterling handed back the notebooks carefully as if they were precious manuscripts, saying he'd be recommending Ethan for the competition, but needed him to understand something, that what he did today developing new techniques and seeing patterns others missed wasn't just talent. It was genius, real genius, and it deserved to be nurtured properly. Ethan said he was happy with the library and online courses, but Sterling's voice was firm, saying no. Ethan deserved better, and he was going to make some calls, because MIT had a summer program for exceptional young mathematicians, and there were mentorship opportunities and research positions. And Ethan shouldn't have to learn alone anymore. Ethan clutched his notebooks with his composed mask, slipping to reveal the 12-year-old underneath, and said, but those programs cost money. And Sterling said to leave that to him because Thornfield had resources and he had influence. Consider it a very small payment on a very large debt. Then paused and added quietly that it was the debt owed when someone almost dims a light that could illuminate the mathematical world. As Ethan left the classroom, Professor Sterling sat at his desk and stared at the elegant mathematics still covering his board. And in 37 years of teaching, he'd never been so wrong about a student because the scholarship boy he'd tried to embarrass had instead taught him the most important lesson of his career. That brilliance had no color, no pedigree, no zip code, and it only needed recognition and opportunity to flourish. And Edmund Sterling would make sure Ethan Williams got both, because he'd spent 40 years building walls around excellence, defining who belonged and who didn't. And Ethan Williams had solved that equation too, proving that brilliance recognized no boundaries and that genius could bloom in the most unexpected soil. The transformation was complete, and what began as a test of a student's worth became a revelation about the price of prejudice and the immeasurable value of keeping an open mind. Because sometimes the greatest mathematical proof isn't written on a blackboard, but lived in the moment when assumptions shatter and truth reveals itself in its purest form. And Professor Edmund Sterling, in trying to prove a student didn't belong, instead discovered that he himself had been solving the wrong equation all along.